We're busy looking at different views on the image of God. So far, we've taken a look at two, and in this lesson, we're going to look at our third one before we move on to questions about sin and resurrection and their relation to the image of God in our remaining two lessons. Now, typically, different views on the image of God get pitted against one another, as if you need to choose one over the others. But we tend to think that they fit together to create a single vision for what it means to be made in the image of God. So thus far, we've only been looking at them separately, each on their own terms. But in a follow-up discussion to this video, we're going to be talking about how we think that they fit together. So far, we've looked at the substantive view and the relational view. And in this lesson, we're going to take a look at what we could call the vocational view. This view is also sometimes referred to as the functional view, or depending on how you cash out the details, you could also call it the royal view. So if you've heard either of those names before, that's the kind of view that we're talking about in this lesson. Now, a vocation is an important role or status given to someone that has some sort of responsibility attached to it. On the vocational view, then, God making humanity in his image is about God giving us a special vocation. In particular, he gives us a royal status to rule or have dominion over the rest of his creation. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the biblical reasons for thinking about the image of God like this, and we're also going to draw out some implications and nuances about the view. So the obvious place to start when thinking about the image of God is the first place it gets mentioned in the Bible, back in Genesis 1, when humans are first created. In Genesis, it says the following: "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" Now we can see right away that the author of Genesis wants us to draw some kind of connection between the image of God on the one hand and human dominion over the rest of creation on the other hand. To make this a bit more precise, we can give three reasons for making this connection. First, on the other days of creation, when additional information is given about the things being created, it's often to describe that thing's purpose or role within the broader system of creation. So for instance, on day 2, God says, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." Here, the separation of the waters is the purpose or function of the expanse. On day 3, the waters are collected together for the purpose of making the dry land appear. And on day 4, the lights are created for the purpose of being signs and for seasons, and for days and years. So then, by the time we get to day 6, and God says of humanity to let them have dominion over the rest of creation, it's natural to understand this as describing the purpose for creating us as his image bearers. The second reason is that the overall message of the creation week should suggest to us that the image of God is connected with being rulers in some way. The author of Genesis has been using the creation week to introduce us to God as the supreme and good creator who rules over everything. And so when we're told that humans are made in the image of this supreme ruler, it's natural to suggest that that has something to do with being rulers over creation as well. And then thirdly, if we expand our view to include the cultural context of Genesis, we find that it was pretty common to connect the image of God with dominion in the ancient Near East. Almost all references we have to the image of God from that time are connected in some way to the king as a way of emphasizing his divinely appointed responsibility to lead the people. Now, of course, the author of Genesis doesn't want to say that only kings are made in the image of God, but there's no reason to think that he doesn't see something in it connected to being rulers. So these are the three reasons then for drawing a connection between the image of God and human dominion in Genesis 1. If we look elsewhere in the Bible, we see this connection confirmed, which we could see by considering just 3 examples. In Genesis 9, when God is talking to Noah and his family after the flood, here he once again affirms side by side our dominion over creation and our being made in the image of God. In Psalm 8, which is a sort of poetic commentary on our creation, David wonders at the fact that God has given us dominion over the work of his hands. Now, it's true that in the psalm, he doesn't mention the image of God explicitly. But if that wasn't what he had in mind when he was talking about dominion, then it's quite surprising that he doesn't mention it at all. If you're going to praise God for how he's created humanity, then surely the image of God should be at the top of that list. And then in the letter to the Colossians, Paul refers to Jesus as the image of God, which in this context is connected to him being the creator and the Lord over everything. So once again, we have the image of God being connected to ruling in some way. So then we have good reason to think that we're made in the image of God to exercise dominion over the rest of God's creation. This is the human vocation which God has given to us as part of the order of his creation. Now, the word dominion might conjure up images of a tyrannical dictator who seeks his own benefit at the cost of his subjects. But this couldn't be further from what the biblical model of dominion is. On the biblical model, dominion belongs to a king who serves the people he rules over. Now, we could quote any number of passages from the New or the Old Testament to show that this is in fact the biblical paradigm of dominion. But something like it is already visible in the creation week that we've been looking at. We've said that our dominion is tied to our being the image of God. But the God we're introduced to in the creation week is someone who blesses his creatures to flourish in the world that he's created for them. It's difficult to see then how we could fail to care for the well-being of his creation and then still live up to the vocation that he's given us. Hugh Spanner has summed up this line of reasoning as follows. If we have dominion over God's other creatures, then we are called to live in peace with them, as good shepherds and humble servants. We cannot say we are made in the image of God and then use that as a pretext to abuse, neglect, or even belittle other species, when God has done none of those things. As kings, we have the power of life and death over them, and the right to exercise it in accordance with the principles of justice and mercy. But we have the parallel duty, not only to God but to them, to love and protect them. So our dominion is not some free license to do whatever we want, but a responsibility to care for God's creation as his limited and finite representatives. But what does it actually look like in practice? We don't have the time to get into all the details of that question, but we can say some general things about what it means for the ways that we treat animals and the environment. Now, on the one side, there are those people who think that animals should have equal rights to humans, and that killing an animal is akin to murdering an innocent human being. On the other side, there are those who don't think about animals really at all, and couldn't care less about their mistreatment. It seems to me that the biblical view is somewhere in between these two extremes. We've already said that we have a responsibility to care for the other animals as God's image bearers, and so we certainly can't be indifferent about their mistreatment. Consider this proverb from Solomon. It says, "Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel." But this doesn't mean that we can go to the other extreme and treat animals as if they were equal to humans. Consider, for instance, what God says to Noah after the flood in Genesis 9. It says, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." Here God makes a distinction between us and the other animals. Because we bear the image of God and other animals don't, killing human beings has a certain weight to it that killing other animals doesn't. It's sort of like the difference between defacing the statue of a king versus breaking the statue of some random person. The weightiness of the action is partly determined in reference to the person whose image the statue bears. So, the biblical view refuses to reduce animals to nothing, but it also refuses to elevate them to the level of human beings. Animals may be killed, but this has to be done humanely without causing them unnecessary pain or bringing too much cruelty to them. And more generally, as God's image bearers, we cannot be indifferent to their mistreatment or their abuse. So for the most part, this should guide the way that we think about the products that we consume. We shouldn't support companies that mistreat animals when testing cosmetics or toothpaste or other such products. And we shouldn't support farming practices that produce food at the cost of being cruel to animals. That will sometimes mean choosing competing products that we wouldn't have otherwise chosen because they treat animals better. Other times it will mean considering not getting the product at all because there aren't any better alternatives. We need to put our money where our theology is and encourage those around us to do the same, for the sake of living out our vocation to care for God's creation. Similarly, there's nothing wrong with us harvesting and using the natural resources of our planet. But when this happens to the detriment of the environment, we need to think seriously about what we're doing. So, the image of God is connected to our dominion over God's creation, and this dominion should be understood as servant kingship rather than tyrannical rule. The last piece of the vocational view to clarify is how exactly the image is connected to the dominion. The worry is this: if the image is constituted by our exercise of dominion over creation, and some of us are better or more capable of that than others, then it would seem that the image of God is not had by everyone equally. In other words, some people would bear the image of God more truly than others. Now, this would be problematic because, as we saw in Genesis, the image of God is given to all humanity without exception. The way that we have articulated the other two views, the substantive and the relational view, brought out the fact that every human being bears the image of God regardless of their abilities. Every human has the same nature, and God can reach every human being where they are. So it would be good for us to articulate a vision of the vocational view along the same lines. And we can achieve this if we just shift our focus slightly from the dominion itself to the royal status that grants us that dominion. When God creates us in his image, what he does is he confers us the status of being servant kings, regardless of our abilities, our position in society, or whatever. We each need to choose how we respond to this, but nothing we do will change the fact that we've been given this status by God. Because the status is granted by God, it can be guaranteed to every human, along with the dignity that comes along with it. I'll close with a quote from Michael Bird, which does a good job of tying this all together. He says, "The image of God is a sovereignly and divinely bestowed status by which we become royal sons and daughters of our heavenly Lord. And it is universally true of every person, irrespective of age, ethnicity, gender, or ableness. Out of that royal status, humanity as a whole, not necessarily every individual, reflects God's goodness and exercises God's reign. People who are disabled share in the royal status even if they are limited in the ways that they can project God's rule over the created order. Humanity is royal in God's sight and is given the important task of ruling and stewarding creation as God's vice-regent. This is the image of God. On this perspective, God is a generous creator who adopts humanity as royal children and invites them to participate in his reign over the world." So that brings us to the end of our lessons on the different views about what it means to be made in the image of God. So far, we've considered each view individually, but as I said, in a follow-up discussion to this video, we'll be looking at how we can combine these views into a single vision for what it means to be in the image of God. So keep an eye out for that. Our next two lessons will focus on the image of God as it evolves through the biblical story, in the face of sin, and then ultimately the work of Christ.